Hello, Earthlings. This is Josh Poe of First Contact Radio. Today we have another interview. This time it's with a woman named Kristn Ann. Kristen Ann is the author of an extremely eye opening book called The Hidden Truth. She was born in the Midwest in the mid 50s and always wanted to understand everything at its deepest levels. As a child, she was the kind of kid who asked teachers questions that they couldn't answer. At 9 years of age, Kristen had a near death experience that gave her proof that there was much more to life than this physical plane or dimension. Starting in the 60s, she read all the spiritual and metaphysical books that she could find, and her inquisitiveness brought a lifetime of fascinating experiences, along with meeting the most incredible teachers and people with in depth knowledge, experiences, and information. It's a lifetime of information that needed to be shared, so she wrote in her book, The Hidden Truth. The intriguing people she met include a UFO contactee from the late 50s. Kristen will share some of the mind-blowing conversations she had with Dan Fry. They include some of the most intriguing details on why extraterrestrials are here on Earth, especially at this pivotal point in time. You can find Kristen's book, The Hidden Truth, at ExploringSacredSpace.com. It contains detailed explanations and information on things you may have always wondered about. Thank you very much for being on the show, Kristen. I really appreciate you being here. I really enjoyed reading your book. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Trying to stay warm.
I completely understand. You're in that cold part of the country.
Yeah.
So, The Hidden Truth. All of your interest in what is taking place in your life seem to have stemmed from being a child. And when you were young, you had this near-death experience that was quite profound. Does it sound like a good starting place for you and where you really became, you entered the story?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happened during that experience? How did that go?
Um, well, I had been walking across the street
Hmm.
and was hit by a car. Um, but the weird thing was that I remember distinctly looking at a bush on the other side of the street and then just totally blanking out. And what happened was I relived that experience over and over and over. Um, I was unconscious for 2 weeks, and I think I relived that experience for maybe 13 days of those 2 weeks. It was just total boring monotony of exactly what all the little minute events leading up to that walking across the street and blanking out. Finding two pennies with my friend, going into the candy store, what we chose, and then getting halfway across the street. And then suddenly I was in a real peaceful setting. I was standing next to a tree, leaning against the trunk of a tree, and in front of me was a small river or brook. And all along the other side were rolling hills dotted with those tall Roman cypress trees. And eventually I crossed the river on this quaint curved bridge to my right
Hmm.
and sat down and leaned against the trunk of a cypress tree. And after a while, from my left, from out of nowhere, behind a trunk of a tree to my left, this person walks out, and there was just something really, really special about him. I knew that I wanted to go with him, and somehow I knew when I thought about it, where he was from, I could see it in stages. First, I saw a distant star. Then I saw his home close up. It was like a white palace. And
Hmm.
then I was standing inside of the entryway, and it was gorgeous. Huge high ceiling with a sort of a balcony to the second floor. And then he reached me and sat down and talked to me, and we spoke for quite a while. And all the while, he knew what I was thinking. He knew that I had made up my mind. I wanted to return with him and didn't want to go back. Somehow I knew that where we were, wherever it was like a middle ground. and he was from this distant planet um, in a different dimension. And he, all the while, was talking me into returning. And I go into it more in depth in my book, which is called The Hidden Truth. You can see it at exploring.sacredspace.com. Um, at the end, he pointed to the sky, which actually was blue and sunny, but he pointed slightly up with his right hand to the right, and a square patch of the sky became like nighttime. And the one he was pointing to was a particular bright star in that formation, and I knew that was Earth. And then I woke up in the hospital and kind of shocked everyone because they all thought that there was no possible way I could live. I had received the last rites 3 times. Um, and the doctors were stunned. They said that they couldn't understand how I could live, that they couldn't understand that with the distance I had flew in the air, the ladies in the beauty shop had seen this little body fly in the air, that I should have broken every bone in my body and be dead. And they said the only way that I could be in this condition, there was literally not a scratch.
Hmm.
No cuts, not a scratch. They said the only way this could have happened was if I was unconscious before the car even struck. And that is exactly what happened. I had been pulled from my body right before it happened, which is, a mysterious incident in itself. And so that's what happened.
Hmm. After this experience and you got out of the hospital, what was your life like then? Do you recall?
Well, um, it was incredibly painful, and maybe it's this way for everyone who has been unconscious for years. And maybe back then, in the 60s, they didn't realize that they had to exercise the legs, um, you know, every day. But it was excruciatingly painful to try to walk. I had to learn to walk and to talk again. I could hardly see. It took a while for my body to readjust to my body.
Hmm.
Um,
And how
so
long did you
it was
say again that how long were you out in once you had the
2 weeks.
experience? 2
2
weeks?
weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you were just having to relearn how to use that physical vehicle that you were in because you were gone for a while.
Right, right.
And then was your perception changed? Did you view the world in a different place at that point, or were you just focused on getting well and really, weren't thinking on the spiritual? Where was your mind at that time?
Well, I think always since birth I was aware of different things more than other people. But since then, I was even more interested in finding out all I could about life, and I knew that there were other levels, other planes or dimensions. And so I read all that I could read on spiritual metaphysical things, which wasn't a lot starting back in the mid and early 60s. But I read all I could find by Edgar Cayce, Ruth Montgomery, Jean Dixon, things like that. Anything that I could find. Um, Books of this sort, were hard to find back then. All the New Age books hadn't come out yet.
Mhm. So, how old were you when you started? Because you said you were 8 when you had the near-death experience, and then how
Right.
soon after that were you starting to read these books and really get more immersed in the
Mm,
spiritual subject?
by age 11, I had
Wow.
begun a collection, yeah.
That's not normally what you hear 11-year-olds reading.
No, no,
So
it's just
something
not.
obviously, it was obviously a very profound experience for you that, sent you on this quest to seek what was out
Right.
there.
Yeah, yeah.
So you read these books, and then along the way, you started meeting teachers. And was Werner Glass, was he one of your earlier teachers?
Right. In my life, uh, I, looking back on it, I can see how, it seems like I was purposely directed and certain people seem to be directed into my life, and certain events seem to be, it's almost like it was choreographed. But I didn't want to go to college, but I was sort of, my parents made me, and I ended up, if I was going to go, I was going to choose one I would at least found interesting. So I went to one out in Oregon, started by these radical hippies from New York City, and it was in this small town south of Portland called Mount Angel, Oregon. And while I was living in this house of a bunch of, hippie types, I took down this book called Alternatives to Education and opened it up to Emerson College in England, which was started by Rudolf Steiner, who was this fascinating clairvoyant. And I ended up finding out through a series of amazing coincidences that there was a Waldorf Institute. Rudolf Steiner started the Waldorf school movement, and there was a teacher training center in Detroit. So I ended up applying and was accepted and went there for 2 years. And while I was there, our head professor who had opened this institute was named Rudolf Steiner. And I came to realize he himself had these abilities of clairvoyance, and the classes were just amazing.
Very
I
interesting.
so mind blowing and eye opening that I included some of the lessons in my book.
Okay, so was Rudolf Steiner one of your instructors, or he was just the one who started this school and this program?
Rudolf Steiner was a clairvoyant who lived from 1860 something to 1925. And he made breakthroughs in every field, arts, education, sciences, even dance, um, and teaching. And so Rudolf Steiner had already passed, but
Okay.
Werner Glass was one of my instructors.
Okay, so you spent 2 years at the Waldorf School, and the Waldorf School is a school that isn't necessarily teaching the way that people are taught. It's people are coming with a different learning process. Is that what's going on there? Is that the intent?
There are Waldorf schools that start from preschool and kindergarten all over the world, many of
Okay.
them. But this was a Waldorf institute. It was a teacher training institute, college level courses to teach people how to. Rudolf Steiner, back in the, toward the beginning of the century, he had lectured, and people realized how enlightened he was. And the director of the Waldorf Astoria cigarette and cigar factory realized how much insight he had, especially with children, and realized how harsh the learning process had been up to that point, especially maybe in Germany and Austria. And he asked Steiner to uh, start a program for teaching his children that would really enhance and bring out their natural abilities. And that's how the Waldorf system started. So
Okay.
these courses, and that's why it was called the Waldorf system. And the courses that I took then were at the college level in learning how to teach.
Okay. And it seems that in chapter two, you begin talking about an experience and lesson that really seemed to kind of set the stage for you, where you talked where Werner was talking about how we were living in the time of Noah and what a crucial time this was in history, and it seems from that point forward, your adventure really kind of began, huh?
Right. This was one of the many, hundreds of fascinating classes. But one of the concepts that Warner explained was that we are living in a time of Noah. And we just sat there on the edge of our seats, as usual. We had no idea what he meant. Werner Glass spoke with a British accent. He had been born himself in Austria and spoke in a deep, profound voice and had the most intense dark eyes. He kind of had the profile of Alfred Hitchcock, and there was just an air of mystery about him, but he taught such amazing classes. Um, and he went on to explain, I explain this in detail in the book, that, and I show a graph that he had showed us. Um, every 26,000 years, roughly, there is a cycle on this planet um, that the Earth goes through. And at either end of this wheel of roughly 26,000 years, there has always throughout history been a big um, shift or cataclysm. Um, I found this so fascinating, and I raised my hand and asked what it was that happened at the last, shift. And he said that it was the great flood of Noah. And most fascinating of all, this was um, this great flood was actually the final, inundation or sinking of Atlantis. And Noah himself had been an Atlantean. The whole thing, the whole concept was so fascinating. And he explained that we are again reaching this point, and we are like the the forerunners who are helping to usher in this age of this point that is coming when there will be a big shift. It may not be the cataclysm where he explains all throughout history at these points, nearly everyone on earth had been destroyed except for a few, and they would have to begin again. All histories would be lost, all technologies would be lost, and what would remain would be legends, as in the legends of Atlantis and Lemuria, which was far before Atlantis even. And we would have to once again start over. And he explained that we are reaching this point again, though it's uncertain whether it will be a complete, almost final, almost complete annihilation. But there will be a big change, and maybe, and it seems to be happening. Well, it's been happening, especially over the last century, the last half a century, in more and more rapidly, this big
Hmm.
change. I mean, we see the huge change from the 1900s. From the beginning of the 1900s, we went from horse and buggies to, jets and interspace travel, rockets.
Hmm. Yeah, we've made certainly come a long way over the short period of
Over the
time,
past, right, yeah,
even just since the 50s.
right.
we've made tremendous after Roswell. We really seem to have made a big jump.
Right. Right.
So, okay, so you're at the college, you're learning, you're understanding that we're in a very significant time, and you leave college, and is this when your journey into the world then began, where you started traveling, and when did that come
Right.
about? This.
I went out west. I met a friend from the Waldorf Institute one summer, and one of the things that she had mentioned she had done was she found a healing center. At that time, it was called Quimby Center, and it was in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And I didn't take it too seriously at first, but I kept thinking about it, and eventually called out there and made an appointment, and went out there to Alamogordo, New Mexico. I knew nothing about Alamogordo, but I had still had this strong sense of intuition.
Hmm?
And when I got in town, I could somehow see that and feel strongly that there had been a strong presence of extraterrestrial activity in that area. And this was in 97 that no, 77 that I went out there initially. And the whole issue of extraterrestrials was so ridiculed from all the disinformation that was going on. People thought you were crazy if you thought the subject was serious. So I brought up the subject real carefully with the people I was staying with, and it just so happened that they not only took it seriously, but they knew a man named Dan Fry who had lived in Alamogordo and had written books of his accounts. He had been a contactee, one of the early contactees, and had written about his accounts. And this was so fascinating to me because back then you couldn't find, accounts of extraterrestrial contact. So they brought out his books, and I read them in the couple of days that I was there, and I was all gung-ho to meet Dan Fry. And I was devastated to find out he no longer lived there, but in the next moment, I was elated to discover that he was living at that time outside of Phoenix. I was, the very next day going on to Phoenix to stay with my sister. So I got into Phoenix, I dropped my bags literally, and got on the phone to call Dan Fry. And he answered the phone in a friendly voice of an old grandfather, and I said that I'd love to come and meet him and discuss in person what it was like to meet an extraterrestrial. And he said, "Oh, sure, why don't you come up for the weekend?" Well, this was on a Thursday, and the very next day, on Friday, I was hopping a bus to spend the weekend with Dan Fry. He was living in Tonopah, Arizona at that time. So I got to know Dan Fry. I was a friend of his. I knew him for 2 years. And over this time, we had the most fascinating conversations of things that he learned, things that he had been told, from the point of view of the extraterrestrials, which included, their purpose for being here, the role their ancestors had played throughout history, and it was just all very, very interesting. And I wrote about it in detail. There's a couple of chapters on it in
Hmm?
detail in my book.
So, what were some of the things you found out about what the role of their ancestors was?
Well, he explained that their ancestors had been visiting Earth for centuries, maybe since the beginning of humanity on Earth. And if you think about it, I mean, some scientists are still questioning, how humans made the leap in such a relatively short time from monkeys and apes to thinking human beings. And they talk about the missing link still. And if you think of it in the light of this extraterrestrial contact, this may be the missing link. If you look into writings by Zecharia Sitchin, who had read ancient Babylonian texts about, ancient extraterrestrials who had come to Earth to mine gold in Africa, and they have found the ancient gold mines that have been abandoned in ancient prehistory. These are ancient things that, aren't brought out much. But if you think of all these things, you can see how if ancient extraterrestrials had been living on Earth, this could very well be the missing link.
Right.
Which brought humans up to the thinking degree that we are right now. Dan Fry explained that the extraterrestrials had told him that there have been extraterrestrials present on Earth as human beings for many thousands of years. And they had told him in the 60s that there were many thousands of them on Earth, back then. By now, there could be millions, hundreds
Right.
of thousands or millions.
So, what were some of the places where they had showed up?
Well, one of the most amazing points, and I go into it in depth in my book, he explained that actually the tribes of Moses had been led by, in the Bible, it's described as a ball of fire by night and a cloud by day, or a cloud of mist by day. And he said it was actually a small spacecraft. And what's so interesting is that spacecraft are even now described as glowing red at night. I saw one out in New Mexico glowing red. And I came to understand that when they are performing certain functions or operations, they do glow red.
Mm-hmm.
And they are known to camouflage themselves in clouds, to create clouds to hide in during the day.
Right. And there's a lot of sightings that are recorded these days which show both of those things, the ships that look like they're on fire and the ships that you can see them actually creating the clouds around them in some instances.
Right, yeah, yeah.
So,
And, well, what was so fascinating to me and mysterious to me was I said, Dan, what was the purpose for isolating these people for 40 years? And he said that they had explained to him that this was necessary. And in viewing all of this with the research that I've done, I came to realize that these people, and from what Dan Fry, this group of Mideasterners held such a negative, so much negativity. It was still an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth vengeance that, from how I saw it, I could see how in our future, in the distant future, from way back then, these people could have caused, I don't know if I'm being clear, But as I see it, this group of people, it was necessary to intervene and to modify this group of people so that the negativity and the vengeance they harbored would not quite be to the degree that it was in our future, for the good of humanity, and that so that humanity didn't annihilate itself. You know, if this intervention hadn't occurred at that point in time, which is how I now understand, we there could have been a danger that we would not even be existing at this point. We could have been annihilated years ago. What they explained to Dan, and I explain it more clearly in my book, was that it was necessary to isolate this group of people until one full generation had passed before once again allowing them to settle in a community.
And it's a very fascinating story in that because are you familiar with the scribe Menetho?
No.
He was a scribe in Egypt, and he was actually writing what was going on there in Egypt. And he was much closer to this time period when all of this went on. And Moses, the story of Moses, as he tells it, that Moses was actually a priest in the temple of Heliopolis, and he was going under the name Osarseph, and he had leprosy. And the king, I believe it was Amenephis, wanted to clean up Egypt, so he sent all of those with leprosy and sickness west of the Nile to work the quarries. And the people rallied around Osarseph to help lead them back and retake back their land. And he changed his name to Moses. They went and they took back the land, but they were so vile and they went and desecrated the sacred temples. They killed, they raped. They were just these vile, warlike beings. And so when they left and were in the desert, and you say that there was an intervention, I mean, it ties right in with that whole story of what they were like.
Oh, interesting.
It just confirms the whole thing that something about who they were wasn't very nice, and they just wanted to kill, kill, kill.
Right, right. It was just so fascinating as Dan explained it all, that as they had explained it to him, that for the future good of humanity, it was necessary to create this intervention, and that the ancestors of the extraterrestrials he had met were actually acting under the direction of this higher source. They themselves were messengers, which the ancient word, Greek word angeloi, angels, means. Angels simply means messengers or emissaries, which they were. And he said, they told him, for 4 years they actually read books that Dan would get them from the base library, and they would copy them. And he asked them what the most interesting was to them, interesting book was, and they said it was our Bible, because they said that their ancestors are recorded in the Bible in several instances as angels.
Hmm.
So this all ties in. And they
Right.
were actually acting as angels, as emissaries of the light.
It is amazing with all of these stories that when we find the bits and pieces that are out there, how they all fit together in a nice picture, like a big puzzle that's coming together.
Right. Yeah, it is.
So you learning from Dan, and then after spending time with Dan, is this set you on your traveling journeys then, where you began going to Egypt?
Well, eventually, I knew Dan Fry from 1977 to 79, and then I moved back east. Um, Eventually, in 1997, 20 years later, I took my first trip to Egypt. And I saw many of these things. There are a lot of images in my book, and you can see them in color if you go to exploringsacredspace.com and click in the upper left. There's a list of chapters, and the clickable ones have the images in them that you can see in color.
Okay.
Um, what's interesting is the ancient temple at Abydos, the Temple of Osiris, um, has this image, and there's a picture of it, of UFOs, of submarines, and various aircraft that were created way back then. So you wonder if it was prophets or if there were actually extraterrestrials living at that time. I mean, the ancient um, the ancient Egyptian whole way of thinking and their pyramids were very much geared toward the heavens. They were very much into the study of stars, and the pyramids on Giza are found and believed to point toward the three stars in the belt of Orion.
So your experiences in Egypt, as you talk in the book, you had a lot of synchronicities, things that seem to bring up memories from other lifetimes.
Right.
It sounded like it was quite a profound experience. Each of the, what did you go, three times?
I went twice.
Twice? Okay. Each of the times you went, it seemed to be that you had a very profound experience.
Right. The first time I went, the trip was for 3 weeks,
Hmm.
um, and each trip was really mysterious because just a couple of days before both of the trips, there was a major catastrophe, and everyone around the world canceled their trips to Egypt. Our group, through Power Places Tours, and led by Greg Braden, happened to be the only groups that were going. And it was really frightening. I mean, it was really I was shaking in my shoes
Hmm.
on the way to, meet up with this group that I didn't know in New York City and fly on to this hostile country. But the first trip, anyway, I ended up getting on this plane in Detroit, flying to New York City on just an average flight to New York from Detroit. And it turned out that the man sitting beside me just happened to be from Cairo. And
Hmm.
he was an engineer on Mount Sinai. Well, we were landing. I was getting a connection in New York to go to Cairo. And a highlight of our trip was we were climbing Mount Sinai. So this was a great synchronicity. He put me at ease. He told me the people were going to be so kind, and so that it set my trip off on just a wonderful sort of note. Um, but what happened the first trip, 3 days before we were to leave, back in 1997, November, there was a great massacre at Hatshepsut's tomb, so everyone around the world canceled their trips to Egypt. And the result of this was that instead of, I guess it's usually packed over there, especially all the temples and sites, like packed like amusement parks. But what happened was it was, a special moment in time for our group because we were the only ones there. So we could walk into these sites and walk around these cities, and the only other people there were the locals, and the sites were empty. So in my case, being real sensitive, I could just feel the energy. And then 2 years later, it happened again. I mean, I just sort of asked myself, just sort of joking, was there going to be another event so that we'd be the only ones again? And sure enough, Egypt Air crashed, and it was the same thing all over again.
Hmm.
But when we got there, standing on the Giza Plateau in front of the pyramids, it flashed back on me what I had experienced as a child of being in a big line of people leading up to the Giza Plateau. And I was actually at the head of this line, and it seemed like a parade to me. So I asked our Egyptian guide, did they have parades in ancient Egypt? And he sort of stared at me. And I said, I was in a parade that went, and I pointed my arm back from that direction across the desert up to this middle pyramid. And he just, his eyes got like saucers, and he looked at the guy standing next to him, and he said, there was royalty that lived in that direction back in ancient times. And I said again, were there parades in ancient Egypt? And he just looked at me and said, you tell me.
Hmm.
And what I learned later was, yes, there were up to sacred ceremonies, only they called them processions. And what I have since learned from John Bunker, who is with the Edgar Casey group, the ARE, that it was actually the middle pyramid is far more ancient than the others. And through his research, he has found that there are ancient records hidden in the middle pyramids. And also, you know, in the passageway between the Great Sphinx underground, leading up to the middle pyramid.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah,
There's certainly been a lot of talk about, finding what might be hidden there or even inside the Sphinx itself.
right,
That must have been
right.
quite a sight to be out there. You described that you had a hotel that was just out looking. You walked out your door and you were looking at the Great Pyramid. Is that correct?
Our hotel was the nicest. It was called the Oberoi, and it is a converted palace right almost adjacent to the Giza Plateau.
Hmm.
Um, it used to be on the outskirts of Cairo and all the hecticness of Cairo. Cairo is like any big city, you know, with honking horns and cars, but the city has sprawled practically out to Giza now, but still, the Oberoi Hotel is more isolated than the others. And we arrived in our hotel. I dropped my bags, and it was nighttime. I went out onto the balcony, and I was just, my breath was taken away. There was the pyramid right there.
Hmm.
Yeah, it was
That must have been
amazing.
awesome.
It was. And I literally heard the words, welcome, we have been waiting for you. And the whole thing was just, there was such an air of mystery about it. And I wondered who the we was.
Hmm.
But the whole trip had so many mysterious incidents in it. And I described them in the book. We truly are living at a significant time in history that is directly related to what happened back in Egypt, particularly during the 18th dynasty, when was one of the lifetimes that I remember having lived. I had a couple of lifetimes, and many of us have, maybe maybe even most of us
Hmm.
have had many lifetimes back in Egypt.
So you described, I guess this is the million-dollar question now. You described that when you spoke with Dan Fry and he told you about the extraterrestrials and what their role of their ancestors were, you also were informed of what their purpose was now. So What is that? Because that's where we're at. We're in the time of Noah. Um, we've got the extraterrestrials. What is the purpose that Dan shared with you?
Well, Dan had convinced, I mean, they had convinced Dan when they first met him that it was necessary because of something big happening in the near future, that their presence was needed on Earth. Um, and they got to know Dan over a period of 4 years before he actually helped what he believed were the first ones to come down and actually live as human beings, as citizens on this planet. He helped the first ones to get actual papers and even a job. He got the first one papers and a job in the Middle East as a trader. And he explained that that was necessary so that he could sort of keep a handle on things and interject peace. Um, and what they explained was that their presence was needed to sort of guide things to go in the best way possible for the energies that were coming on the planet at this time. That there would be intense energies. And actually, Werner Glass, my professor,
Hmm.
had explained this also. Werner explained that there was a major event happening in our lifetimes, and that just simply to keep the planet in one piece until this happened, till this point of destiny happened, it would be necessary for the hierarchy, as he called them, to shower the planet with intense energies that they would send streaming to the planet. And he said that there would be segments of society who would not be able to handle it, and that there would be groups and people who would just exhibit erratic behaviors. And when I see the mass shootings and things, it really falls in line with what he said. And so now, as I see things, there are different benevolent groups coming to the planet. There
Hmm.
are both interdimensionals, extraterrestrials, and those known as the great spiritual beings known as the hierarchy, coming to help the planet at this point in time.
So where is this all leading?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I have just been an observer and, sort of documenting what I have learned along the way. But as I come to see it, this transition is sort of being guided to be as least traumatic as possible. From what I have learned, it is important for as many people to make this transition alive as possible, unlike all the ones in the past where only a very few have lived and have had to begin civilization again from sort of the Neanderthal age, and all technologies were lost each time and they had to begin again. This time, it seems to be important that we all make it as a group alive. And what I can see is that, you know, this whole New Age movement seems to me to have been guided so that people's awareness awaken more and more and more to the point where they are awake enough to be able to handle these energies that
Right,
are coming in more and more intensity, to be able to handle and make this transition, consciously.
right.
So it's happening more gradually as I see it.
Well, it is definitely fascinating, and In my studies as well, I've have come across information which definitely leads us to understanding that this is going to be different. The Book of Enoch, I really enjoy that one very much. I think it's a crucial book for our time, and it starts off in the beginning talking about how when God returns, the wicked and the godless are going to be removed, and how the righteous and the elect are going to be fine. And it's repeated
Right.
over and over throughout that book and throughout actually many scriptures and texts that something about this time is going to be different. We're not going to sink. This time we're going to swim. This time we're going to make it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to look at these ancient scriptures in the light of all these things that are happening now, and
Right?
especially in the light of these lessons that I have learned along the way, including at the Waldorf Institute, and all the things that the teachers and the travels that I have done have brought forward, which is why I wrote this book, because there are many things that will help people to understand what is going on now.
Excellent. Well, I very much enjoyed the book. I think that anybody who picks this book up will definitely be able to learn from it. It's written in a way that is very easy to understand. And that is very helpful because sometimes people turn away from material when it's overly scientific or wordy or this or that, and you just kind of spell it out in a nice, easy to understand way.
Right. And yeah, like I said, I feel that there are things in this book that won't be found elsewhere. And it's really important to give a clearer understanding of what is going on. And if people go to my site, exploringsacredspace.com, to get the book, I can sign it for them if they'd like. You can, when you're checking out, scroll down to the text area and let me know how to sign it, if you want me to sign your name or not, and I can ship it out myself.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, Kristen. This was very insightful, and your book is very good, and I hope lots of people pick this up and read it and learn what you have are sharing with them.
Thank you, Josh. It was nice talking with you.